All right, still all back here. Maybe my camera actually focused today. Let's just roll the cover up here, and we can all agree that taking the bearing caps off is going to be a quick way to tell us if there's a bearing issue. But what I don't want to do is just look into it and say there's a bearing issue, and that be the end of it. I want to look at every part, every piece, and see if we can determine conclusively, or at least close to it, what actually happened. What came first, the chicken or the egg? Let's find out. Let's dig into this thing. Let's take a look at these parts. We're going to look at all the parts individually and see if we see anything wrong with each part. Maybe it wasn't one thing that failed. Maybe it was two. Maybe it was three. Maybe a whole bunch of issues compounded. So let's dig into it and find out.
I'd say it's a nut job.
All right. So this is the first thing I'm going to look at. Here's the oil pan stuff. Let's see. There is some bits. What are these? This is, well, that doesn't actually look like metal. That looks like a piece of rubber. Yeah, that's soft and squishy, that piece right there. There's a piece of rubber right there, but that's not actually metal bits. Now keep in mind, since this motor is disassembled, some of the stuff may have been washed away. Oh, let's see. What do we got right here? My camera is having, my forward-facing camera is having focusing issues in the last few videos. Let me look right here real close. This almost feels like sand, like grit. That's a piece of gasket, so it probably came off of that after it was taken apart. So this stuff right here, though, is real sandy, real gritty feeling. Let's take the windage tray. Okay. Let's lay this over here. This right here, that is bits of like iron. It's not bearing material. It's like black iron. It's metal pieces. Maybe that's what that other was, actual metal pieces. Let me look at this again, see if there's still some stuck to it. Yeah, it feels real gritty like sand. But I think that's little specks of black iron. Like pieces of the block is what I'm saying when I say iron. This piece of grass right here, I know wasn't in the motor. Yeah, let's see. Let me get my down in this right here. The oil's good and clean though, right there. All right. So we have some what appears to be pieces of block material, which I don't understand why there'd be pieces of block. Okay, well, let's look at other stuff. Okay, here's the cam that came out of it. This cam is not going back in this engine, by the way. I just want to, so it's got some stuff from the bed of the truck on it, but I just want to see how the loads and all look. See if we can see any, because this thing was literally fresh, put on a dyno, fired up, and had very low oil pressure and was shut down. The entire cam, I don't think the camera's going to catch it. The entire cam feels gritty. But again, that could be stuff off the truck. I'm more or less looking at the lobes. This lobe's got a chunk gone out of it. This lobe right here has a chunk missing out of the lobe. Was it like that ahead of time? I don't know. I have no idea. But I know it's missing a chunk now. All the lobes look good. This one, wait a minute. This one right here, I don't know if you can see these. This one and this one, the camera's not focusing real well. You can see it a little more on that one. Has what looks like a wear spot on it. But this thing was, that's the only ones that are showing that. And this thing was just fired and shut off. Shouldn't have made that much of a witness mark. But the only thing I actually see with the cam is this one lobe that a chunk has been taken out of it. And that's rough. That's like it was chipped out. Alright, so here's a tote of the parts that were on it and taken off. Let's just go ahead and lay some of this stuff out of the way. I did not know Edelbrock made their own coil. Huh. Interesting. There's a gasket set for the new build. Lay this out of the way. The oil pump. Let's take a look at the oil pump. I'm going to pop the top off this oil pump in just a few and we'll look inside of it. Let's look at this timing chain. Inside the cover, I don't see any evidence of anything in this cover. Let's flip a valve cover over and see what the inside of it looks like. Absolutely spotless. There's nothing inside the valve cover. Now, I don't know if anything's been cleaned or not. I don't know, so I'm just looking at it for what it is. Parts in a box. This one, oh, that's just oil. So it looks clean. Let's open that oil pump up and take a look at that oil pump and see if there's metal inside this oil pump right here and see what's in there. So a lot of people would never think about opening the oil pump up, taking the top off of it. I'm not going to reuse this oil pump. We're going to put another one in it. But in theory, there's nothing wrong with the oil pump unless there was something wrong with the oil pump. You know what I mean? Because low oil pressure, there could have been something going on with the oil pump. That does not explain the actual iron bits in the block. In theory, some of the iron could have went through the engine and scarred up some bearings, yes. But my thought pattern is, and I know everybody's going to have different thoughts on this, but my thought is it would have had to have actually ran a few minutes for it to go through there and scar everything up. What I'm saying is it would not have just started up with low oil pressure. It would have had oil pressure and then kind of gradually went away, if you understand what I'm saying. Because it needs to, oil pressure comes from your bearing clearances, basically. There's other places, but generally speaking, oil pressure comes from your bearing clearances. Now, yes, they can be check valves, or they can be having a brain fart here. The plugs, you know, one of them could be out or leaking, or, you know, there's other places that can. But in a general engine where all things are considered and all things are in there right, the oil pressure you make is from your bearing clearance. And if bearing clearance makes the oil pressure, any metal that goes through it has to go through it enough to shave away some clearance. I'm trying to explain it so everybody can understand it, but that's the basic gist of it, is that if your clearance, but the distance between, let's say, your crank and your main bearing, that distance is what creates your oil pressure. In order for metal that goes through the engine to affect that, it has to go through it enough to take away some of that. Now, depending on the metal that goes through it, that could happen quick or it could happen slowly. But it has to happen. So, from my understanding, unless I misunderstood the situation, as soon as they fired this engine up on the dyno, it had low oil pressure, like 8 pounds of oil pressure. It had almost no oil pressure. So I don't think those little iron shavings or little iron dust that we found, while not good and will eventually cause problems, I don't think that caused this problem. Generally speaking, when a block is machined, it goes through a wash after that, and most machine shops will then clean all the galleries and all that out. It is entirely possible that this one did not get fully cleaned after the machining process. That is the one issue. The second issue, I think, is a completely separate issue, which is the oil pressure issue. Again, it had to have ran before that would have been an issue. So let's open up this oil pump and see what's inside of it. And that should tell us a lot about what actually got pumped through the engine. First thing is first, every one of these bolts on this oil pump is loose. I don't know why. I don't know if that would affect a lot as far as oil pressure. Possibly. Could it pass through here? I don't know. I really don't know. I've never actually seen one the bolts were loose on, so I don't know if that would or not. My thought says oil could have passed through here, but there's no evidence of where you would see anything running through here. And it feels like it's sealed. So I think that's just an anomaly. I don't think that really means anything, because yeah, it's sealed. Oh, what? Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just stuck to it right there. Okay. Maybe it wasn't sealed. Let's see. Do we see anything here? Oh, just clean oil right there. Okay. Let's move us back here in the sunlight. If you've never seen an oil pump, this is how an oil pump works. It basically creates, let's say, a vacuum by the way these turn together and the way they fit. It basically creates a vacuum that sucks the oil up through here. You can pull this right out. It's hard to do with one hand. Let's look and see what we see. Although I don't see any metal in here, look at the amount of wear that's on a brand new oil pump. It's got noticeable wear marks for something that was only fired up on the dyno and ran for just a second on the dyno. It's got some noticeable wear marks right there. None on this. Just on the outside of the housing. Some noticeable wear marks. But what I don't see, what I do not see in here, I know it's hard for y'all to see, is I do not see any kind of metal inside the oil pump. The oil pump appears to be clean. The only concerning thing I see with the oil pump, honestly, is the amount of wear on this for just a short run. That's noticeable to the touch. Like I can feel that as I run across there. Could the oil pump have been bad in this motor? Okay, so I'm not a guy that is a oil pump machinist or engineer or whatever you want to call it. I'm smart enough to know if you take an oil pump apart, you can see what went through the engine. And they're very simple in how they work. There's 2 little gears in there. Excuse me. Just 2 little gears in there. So the question becomes, how did that oil pump, again, and just starting up on the dyno, seeing there was very, very little oil pressure, and then shutting it off, how does that oil pump have a wear mark like it on the outside? And for those that actually know the engineering behind an oil pump, my understanding is the oil pressure comes from, and there's a spring and a shaft down at the bottom. I didn't show you that has a plug on the back of it. I'll show it to you right now. And my understanding, that's what creates the oil pressure, is that spring and that plug. Hang on. Be this piece right here. There's a spring and a shaft in there with a plug in it. My understanding, that's what creates the oil pressure. With that being said, would that wear on the outside of that, let's call it a gear, even though it's not a gear, but would the wear on the outside of that affect the oil pressure that the pump made? Would that cause an oil pressure issue? Now, this is all conjecture because, again, we have not popped any bearings off and looked at them. But could this be a bad oil pump? Is it possible that the oil pressure was oil pump related entirely? Now, if this is true, because technically it did have oil pressure, it was not zero, it didn't fire up with no oil pressure, and it obviously pumped oil through the engine. Because we can even see it on the valve covers, the oil. So we know that just by the evidence at hand. But what this will tell us is, now if we pop off a couple of random caps and look at a few random bearings, if the bearings look good with no scarring, and then we're going to take this motor apart and build it from ground up anyway. Then once we take everything apart and we start measuring clearances and they look good, could this have been a bad oil pump that caused this problem? I don't know yet, and honestly, neither do you till we get deeper into it. We're just starting the investigation, and it may just be that the clearance of that doesn't even matter, that could have rubbed itself to death and it wouldn't have even affected the oil pressure, because the oil pressure comes from the spring and the clearance and all on that shaft that I showed you. But again, I'm not an engineer when it comes to oil pumps. I understand what makes them function, but as far as cause and effect on what works inside of one, no, I mean, not really. I understand that there's people out there that blueprint them and do things of that nature, and I understand the basics of all that. I guess what I'm saying is, I don't know, the nuts and bolts of it is, I don't know if that wear pattern that we've seen on that oil pump would actually affect that oil pump in any way. I think it's kind of weird that an engine that only ran for a few seconds or minutes or whatever it was, could cause that much wear on an oil pump, because that was noticeable. I mean, you could rub your hand across it and feel almost like if you've ever done a brake job on a disc brake, how a rotor feels when it hasn't been turned in a long time, the little kind of ridges you feel across there, you could feel that on that oil pump. What I do like from this is, I see absolutely no metal shavings at all, no metal debris or no metal of any kind inside that oil pump. But if that wear on that outer ring happened during the time it was running, it is past It's on the engine side of that screen, which means that anything that came off of that would have went directly on into the oil filter, because the oil filter would have been the next stop. I do not have the oil filter. I know they cut the oil filter open and looked at it and found metal in the oil filter. I do not see any metal in the oil pump. So could the metal in the oil filter have been from the oil pump eating itself? Can an oil pump eat itself? We have a lot of questions that I don't know the answers to. But none of it actually matters in the big picture, because now we're going to take and dig into the block and see if we can figure out if there's any bearing issues or anything in the block. We may have multiple issues going on, and they may have all compounded into one issue, or this engine just may have multiple issues going on that are unrelated to each other, but could have caused other problems down the road. So at the end of the day, maybe low oil pressure was just a blessing from the Lord to start with, so that all these other issues could get found. I can say I'm sitting here rotating this oil pump by hand right now, and there's also, if you ever dealt with drum brakes and you'll turn them and there'll be that one little spot where it feels like it hangs up, you can feel that with this as well. Interesting. Here's what I'm talking about with that. You can turn this oil pump and it gets to about right there, and it really hangs up, and you gotta, it's just that one spot. It turns fine everywhere else, and it only hangs up on that one spot every once in a while. And now it's turning fine. And got right back to that one spot and hangs up. I don't know at all. I'm not going to take any guesses right now, because again, this is not a in-depth guess session. This is, let's look at all the evidence, and once we've looked at every single part, see what we can come up with as a logical conclusion of what happened to this engine. So we know this whole motor's coming apart now, and we're going to go back to ground zero and start over. And so I'm not worried about a clean surface right now. Let's flip the motor up here on the tailgate of the truck, where we haven't unloaded anything yet. Look at the bottom end and see if I see anything just obvious here. I think what I'll do is pop off one of these main caps to take a quick look. Maybe the number 2 here. Looks like it'd be easiest to get to. And then we'll pop off maybe a couple of these rod bearings here and take a look at them. What I don't see is any kind of discoloration, like it spun a bearing was getting hot or anything. I don't see anything like that. Which again, this motor wasn't ran very long, so it shouldn't have. But let's just do a quick peek at one of these bearings. If metal went through this thing, all the bearings should have some scarring on them. Not necessarily a fact, but it should. So if I pop this one off and it looks like brand new, we might want to look at another one. If I pop this one off and there's some scarring on it, then we know something went through this and the bearings are chewed up. But we may pop a couple of these off and just take a look at them and see if we see any evidence on a bearing. All right, so it takes 2 hands to loosen the cap up. So let's take a look at it first. Look, all right, let's look at the bearing. You know what? That's oil. My forward-facing camera does not focus for nothing anymore. I think it's about time to upgrade phones. You know what, though? This bearing looks good. I don't see any evidence that anything hurt this bearing. There's a tiny little spot on the bearing right there, but it's right on the side of the bearing, which has no effect on anything. Let's take a second one off and look at the second one. Crank is clean. I don't see Anything on the crank? That was on my finger. I don't see anything on the crank. Let's look at the bearing. Yeah, that bearing is, I wish my camera would focus a little better. That bearing is spotless. There's no scarring or anything on that bearing. Okay, so we took 2 main caps off, which in theory is what makes your oil pressure. We took 2 main caps off. The first one had a little spot on it, but it was really on the side, so that shouldn't have any effect on anything. Probably got nicked in the assembly somehow, or not necessarily in the assembly, but in the, well, yeah, in the assembly, because it might have got nicked when it was, you know, taken out of the box and put on there, not necessarily when the cap was put on. Could have just tapped it against something, or, but it's on the side. That wouldn't affect the oil pressure in any way. The bearings in those 2 that we took off honestly look new. They don't look like there's any issue with the bearings at all. I didn't see any obvious gouging, scratches, or even any wear marks on them. And I'm having problems for some reason with my forward-facing camera. For those that don't know, I do all my video on my phone. And I'm having some kind of issue with my forward-facing camera the last couple of days. It's not wanting to focus. So I'm not real sure how good that footage is going to come out until I start editing. But the bearings look great. Don't look like they got any wear or any run on them at all. Is that conclusive evidence? No, absolutely not. We won't know until we completely disassemble the engine and check bearing clearances. But I would imagine that even one that was a little big on the clearance still wouldn't have that low of an oil pressure. I would think a little bit of clearance, it would have probably still had 20, 30 pounds at least, maybe 20 pounds, 25, somewhere in there. But from what I was told, the minute this engine fired up, it had about 8 pounds of oil pressure at best. So, with no evidence of wear or anything showing on the bearings, like nothing passed through them, the only thing I've seen that shows glaring wear, that shows an obvious issue, is what we've seen with that oil pump. Does that mean it was the oil pump that caused this? No, not at all. I guess what I'm saying is I think I have more questions now than answers. I have presented to you all the evidence as we find it. I'd like to hear what you think down in the comments. Now, let's keep the comments civil. We're not trying to badmouth any company as far as their parts. We're not trying to badmouth any person. We're not trying to badmouth anybody or anything or any company or any product or anything. What we're trying to do is just learn. By doing diagnoses like this, we learn new things. Like for me personally, I've opened up I've opened up oil pumps before and looked at them for evidence of metal and things like that. I've never seen one with that wear pattern. So now I file that away in the back of my head for the future. Is something when there's issues with engines, I'm going to look at now. I never would have thought of looking at that before. This is just one of those where I'm trying to look through everything and see what is going on. What we know so far, I don't know if I'll get the crank and all that out in this video or not, because again, we're starting over from scratch now. I don't want to use the word scrapping everything. We're not scrapping anything, but we're scrapping this build and starting over. I'm going to take the crank out. The crank is going to go to the machine shop and at least be polished and make sure of the dimensions of the crank. Make sure that wasn't off a little. All the pistons and rods and everything are coming out. The block is going to get it's a shame because I want to repaint it because the paint looks so good on this block, but it's going into a hot tank. It is going to get repeatedly washed. It's going to get brushes run through galleys. It is going to get a thorough cleaning, which means all the cam bearings and everything's got to come out. All the plugs got to come out. It's going back down to a bare block, and it's going to get thoroughly cleaned because it's a fresh bore, and all the bore is good. The pistons are all numbered. They can go right back in the same hole. But we need to make sure, well, the pistons are going to get cleaned as well, but we need to make sure that we clean this thing so that any residue that we found in like the oil pan isn't anywhere else in the motor. The only place I found so far any evidence of that iron material was in the oil pan. I didn't find any evidence of it in the oil pump. It's possible some was in the oil filter. I don't know, but I don't see any evidence of it anywhere else on the engine or on the block or anywhere to make me think it really went through anywhere. But because it was present, the block is getting washed, heavily washed, cleaned, brushes going through it, all that. So the block is going to get cleaned just to make sure that none of this comes up again. I do not think that had effect on the oil pressure. The oil pressure is going to come down to one of two things, in my opinion. If you have a different opinion, you can let me know in the comments. Right now, as I said, the bearings look clean. I don't see any issue with the bearings. One thing I do want to kind of take a peek at, if I can get up in there and see them, is the cam bearings. I haven't done that yet. But I don't see any evidence of wear on the bearings at all. Now, could they be one of them? Sure. But would one of them really make the oil pressure that low? So it's going to come down to one or two things. Once we get it completely disassembled, we will measure bearing clearances and see where the clearance is on them. That could be an issue. But again, I think it would have been less dramatic because the engine rotates smooth as silk. So, or the thing that we really don't want to admit is, for some reason, I don't know why, but we don't want to admit it, it could have been the oil pump. I guess the reason I don't want to admit it could be the oil pump is because kind of blatantly ignored the KISS method, keep it simple, stupid, and went for the most complicated problem. This is why I like to dig into things and investigate things. It is entirely possible that it was an oil pump problem. You hate to think that because brand new parts, right? But in the modern world, we've all gotten brand new parts that was an issue. Modern world, you got to be a little more picky about looking at your parts. That oil pump may have been chewed up before it was. That may be part of the manufacturing process. Maybe I'm not sure how they're made, but let's say if you're thinking in terms of a lathe, how it runs across it, the lathe may have skipped right there and gouged it out. I don't know. I don't even know if they're made on a lathe. I don't know how they're made. I don't work at the manufacturing company for them. I'm not even going to mention the name because I really don't want people bad mouthing parts companies or people or anything, because that's not what this is about. This is not about pointing the finger. This is not about being negative. This is not about trying to talk bad about anybody or any company. This is literally a learning experience. This is about digging in here and trying to learn what happened to this engine. So yeah, the next step is to pop the pistons and crank out of it and dive in and measure bearing clearances and see if there was a bearing clearance issue. You've been presented with all the evidence as we find it. I know some of you have already drawn a conclusion of what you think it is. Some of you probably had a conclusion in the video where we went and picked it up that you already knew what it was. Some of you probably surprised at what we found. But with all that being said, it is to the point where now we got to disassemble it and dig in and see if we can figure out what happened to it. A more conclusive conclusion. That is a mouthful of what happened to this thing. Right now, I have my thoughts, but I'd like to hear what you got to think. Can I not talk today? His speech and vocabulary completely left me today. Right now, I would like to hear what you guys think about what possibly could have happened here. But, yeah, this is a weird one. This is a weird one because everything that we've looked at that should cause the problems seem to look okay. While the only thing oil pressure related I found, well, we done talked about that. Yeah, the only thing we can do now is tear it down to the block and measure bearing clearances and double check that. I don't think bearing clearance is an issue. I don't think that's going to be an issue at all. But you can't rule it out till you rule it out. You know what I mean? So, now granted, all that could have fell out, but there's big webs on these blocks, and I don't see, even running my finger in there, it's clean. I don't see any evidence. Caps are all clean. Crank. You know, you would expect something to be stuck to it somewhere. But I don't. I mean, that's all smooth and clean. There's nothing there. You would expect some metal residue to be in there since there is some in the pan. But could there have been, some of that metal residue, say, from the machining process if it didn't get cleaned the way it was supposed to? Once you put the oil in there, it kind of got washed down and settled into the bottom of the pan, and it went from there. Never actually made it through the oiling system. Eventually it would have, without a doubt. I don't know. It's a strange one, guys. It really is a strange one. I expected to find, just like I'm sure a lot of you did, I expected to find smoking guns on these caps when we popped them off and looked at the bearings. I fully expected to find a smoking gun that the bearings were eat up with metal. They're not. I have seen no evidence of any metal in the bearings at all. I've seen no evidence of scarring in the bearings at all. I'm completely bewildered at what is going on here. I don't know. I know we're going to take it apart. Like I said, it's going in a hot tank. everything's going to get cleaned, and go from there. I know they found some metal in the oil filter, but I believe I was told it was more of that iron looking metal. But what I don't know is that from the machining process, or is that from the oil pump eating itself? I don't know. I don't know. Okay, I've had some time to sit and think on it. Had a conversation with the gentleman who owns the short block. We have come to the conclusion that we believe the block did not get thoroughly cleaned as it should have in the beginning from the machine shop process. Again, not gonna mention any names because we're not gonna talk negative about nobody. It's not what we do here on this channel. We're just gonna problem solve and hope that we learn so that we can not have this ever happen again. The hypothesis, the working hypothesis at the moment is that there was some kind of debris left in the block somewhere from the machining process. That either they shortcut the hot tank process, or they didn't brush out the galleys or something. Now, I assume all machine shops do the same. I know the ones around me, that's part of the process, that I've witnessed them after machining one. It goes in the hot tank, it gets cleaned, it comes out, they blow air through all the passages and all, it goes back in the hot tank a second time and comes out and gets brushes and all ran through. I know the couple of machine shops around me, they do it that way. That's already in the billing. When you pay them to bore and hone a block, it's part of it. Now, did that get done on this one? I don't know, but I'm not pointing any fingers. What I'm going to say is it appears that there might have been some debris left in the block. That debris, once it was filled with oil, probably got washed into the pan. The pan, well, I should say the pump then picked it up from the pan, and the pump ate itself on metal shavings somehow. They made it through the screen on the pickup. Now, again, this is a working theory. And the pump ate itself alive, put the metal shavings into the filter. Now, looking at the bearings, no metal made it past the filter. So it's best case scenario for what it is, I guess is the way to say it. But it appears that possibly, and again, working theory, that some of the shavings or debris or dust or whatever it was you want to call it got sucked up in the oil pump. The oil pump then ate itself, and once the oil pump ate itself, it didn't have the clearances to make the pressure that it should have. You see what I'm saying? So that is the working theory at the moment. Is that actually what happened? That is my working theory. All right, so I got the engine out of the back of the truck. It's in the shop, dangling here. I have a couple of options. One, and the original thing we had planned on doing was a short block sitting right there. Short block sitting right there that I know 100% is good because it's my short block. It's fresh. It's only been fired up and run through a break-in. And again, it's my short block. Make good oil pressure, the whole 9 yards. We could take all their top end stuff, assemble on that, and send them home with a known good engine. Second option, and the one that's probably going to be most likely, is we take that
short block that they brought to me, and we go through it and just completely redo it. Now, I say the original plan when I talked to them was I was going to bring them my short block and swap out with them, and they were going to reassemble the engine. After talking with them, we decided that we just build the engine for them. And there's some differences, and I know they've got some plans with this engine. I'm trying to get the sun glare out of it. I know they've got some plans with this particular engine, and it was kind of built for those plans. So putting my short block with their top end would change a few things, because my short block has flat top pistons, it's zero decked, a little more compression, so it would change things on their end. So we're probably, man, I need a haircut. So we're probably not going to do that. We're probably just going to rebuild this short block, go through it, figure out what happened, and rebuild it. We're going to pull it apart. We're going to measure every one of these journals. But we'll do that in the next video as we start into it deeper, because this video has already went extremely long. And again, I do them on my phone. So anything over about 30 minutes is terrible to try to upload. Once we get into it and know for sure about the bearing clearances, then I think we can draw a pretty good conclusion of what happened with this oil pressure issue. I have a pretty good idea of what's going on with it now with the evidence we've already looked at, but we're not just going to give up and say, I think I know what it is. We're going to look at every single component of this thing and have a definitive, this happened. I hope the Lord blesses you more today than he did yesterday. God bless each and every one of you. Thank you for those who watch and subscribe. Thumbs up, comment, and all that stuff. I greatly appreciate every one of you. I hope the Lord blesses you today more than he did yesterday, as I said. May God's glory shine on you. And we're going to call this one right here, because, again, it's already getting long. And we'll see you in the next one.
I'd say it's a nut job.